Hello everyone, in this video we are going to talk about Python classes. There's quite a bit to talk about, so this topic will be covered across multiple videos, with this video just covering the basics. First, a little bit of a computer programming lesson that probably should have been covered earlier, but I didn't think to do so at the time, so sorry about that. The topic of this lesson is programming language paradigms. Programming languages are classified with what is called a paradigm. These paradigm classifications are based on features that a programming language supports. Because of this, languages will typically have multiple paradigms. We actually already know about one of Python's paradigms. In the video about Python data types, I talked about static typing and dynamic typing, which controls how variable data typing is handled. In this case, Python has the paradigm of a dynamically typed language. So what does this have to do with classes in Python? Well, another one of Python's paradigms is that it is an object-oriented programming language. A lot of what we use in Python is an object. In fact, things like integers, floats, booleans, and so on that would normally be considered a primitive type in a language like C++ are actually objects in Python. And classes are what allow us to create objects in the first place. Think of a class as a blueprint that defines an object and allows us to specify what that object has, such as variables and functions. Functions defined under classes, by the way, are typically referred to as object methods, but you can call them either or. With classes, we can pretty much define any kind of object that we need for our programs. Some examples include specialized data objects like matrices, networking objects like servers to manage connections, GUI classes for buttons, text fields, and so on. Even in video games, pretty much everything is an object. The player, the NPCs, the items, even your HUD. And there's no real limitation of the data that you can store in an object. You can store data types, you can store data structures, and even other objects inside of an object. And as a friendly reminder, you can store objects into data structures as well. So let's jump into some coding, shall we? Alright, so let's build our first class. We're going to build a very basic class, and I'll walk you through it step by step. So the first thing we need to do is start with our keyword, which is the word class. Then we need to give it a name. And the naming rules for a class name is basically the same as a function name and a variable name. You can have underscores, you can have letters, and you can have numbers. That being said, I've never really seen a Python class contain numbers. I have seen Python classes contain underscores, but usually that underscore is at the beginning of the class name, not in the middle. I'm not saying you can't put one in the middle, it's just that I haven't really seen Python classes that do that. Typically, for the most part, a class name is just all letters, and the first letter is capitalized. That's the expected naming convention for a class name. So we're going to call our class Pilot. Now, we've got one or two things we can do. The first is just simply end the line with a colon and then start a new line. However, sometimes we can open up a pair of parentheses and we can specify another class in here to specify that you're inheriting from a particular class. I won't get too much into that here. We'll talk about that in another video, but I do want you to know that this is something we can do. But for now, typically what I do, I just immediately add a colon followed by a new line, which, as you can see, automatically indents our code. This is because class is another code block and is therefore controlled by indentation. Now we need to create our constructor. The class constructor is basically the code that gets executed when an object is created. Technically, constructors aren't required for a class, but you can have one if you need one, and most of the time you will probably have one, because that's how you initialize a lot of your variables and stuff. So to create our constructor, we start with the keyword def, and the constructor name is the same across all classes. Underscore, underscore, init, underscore, underscore, followed by a pair of parentheses. And the constructor, as well as all functions inside a class, have to have at least one parameter. And that parameter is a self-reference to the instance of the object that is created using this class. Typically, we refer to this as self. It's not required for it to be called self. If you're someone who comes from C++ and Java, you could call it this, but it's usually recommended to use self because that's just what Python uses in general. And a lot of syntax checkers and code analysis tools, they run through your code and they see some other word other than self. They might throw a bit of errors and stuff. It's not a keyword. It's just a regular word. It's just accepted to use the word self. And it's always got to be the very first parameter of any function. So there's our first parameter. Now we need to define some parameters that get passed into the constructor when we try to create our object. Since we're creating a pilot, we're going to start with two easy ones: the name and the ID. And just like with functions, we can set these up with default values. So we'll say default name pilot and default ID 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So now we got two parameters and they have default values. So then we hit colon and then another new line. And now we're defining the code block for this constructor. So this is where the word self comes into play. Whenever we are referring to variables that will be inside the instance of an object, or we're calling other object functions within another function of that object, we have to use the self word to refer to that instance of the object. So we say self name equals name. What we just did here was we specified that every object will have a variable called name within its instance. And we are specifying that the value of name inside the parameter of the constructor is going to be assigned to the name that belongs to the instance of the object. And we're going to do the same thing with ID. So now we have a constructor that takes in the name and ID inside the constructor and it assigns it to object instance variables called name and ID. And as you can see, not every variable we can use in here has to be part of the instance. We can create temporary variables that will disappear once the function finishes doing whatever it's doing. So if we had to do something that required a temporary variable, we could create one like this, like x equals 1 or 0 or something, and then do a while loop or something that counts up to a certain point using x as the counter. And then once this constructor ends, x disappears. It no longer exists because we didn't start it with self.x. We just said x. All right, so now we've got a constructor. We've got some variables that will be in our object when we set them. Now we're going to create some functions or object methods that our object will be able to call. So like with normal functions, we start with the keyword def, and then we give our function a name. So I'll create some very basic functions. The first one will be greet. And as I mentioned before, at a minimum, first parameter has to be self. We'll add a colon. We won't have any parameters. And then we'll just make it simple. It'll be a print message. Hello, my name is self.name. Whenever we want to use the variable that belongs to the object, we have to make sure we do the self reference, which is why every function has to have the first parameter as self. That's why it's important. So that's our first function. Next one will be present ID self. Another print message. And there you have it. We've got two functions. So when we create objects, we can have those objects call those functions if we so desire. We of course can create functions that can take in values as well. So let's see here. We'll say set ship. This will be a good example. Self, and then we're going to take in a parameter, ship name, colon. Now we've only created variables in the constructor so far, but we're not limited to just creating variables there. We can pretty much create them anywhere from within the class. So we can create variables that weren't there before from functions. So we'll say self ship equals ship name. And there we go. Now, this isn't the only way to assign variables. There are actually a couple of different ways to assign variables to objects. This is one way to do it. Another way we can do it is simply by saying, let's create an object real quick. So we'll say pilot and we'll use the default stuff. But then I can say x.ship equals cargo. And this is a perfectly acceptable way of doing that because I can then print the variable. And then when I run the code, it prints out cargo. Now there is a third way to handle variables in an object, and that's through the use of three functions: get attribute, set attribute, and has attribute. These allow us to read, assign, and check for the existence of variables inside of objects. So the first one we're going to demonstrate is has attribute. Has attribute, as its name implies, allows us to check to see if a variable exists inside of an object. And if it does, it returns true. If not, it returns false. So obviously, because of how it functions, these are best used inside conditional statements. So it takes in two arguments. The first will be the object we're testing, which is X. And then by string value, we name the variable that we want to check for. So we're going to just check for ship. And if it's found, we'll say ship found. And then to demonstrate the next function, let's also print out the return value of get attribute, where like with has attribute, we provide it the object and then the name of the variable by string. Else, if it can't find it, we say print ship not found, assigning ship. And then we'll say set attribute. And this function takes three arguments: the object, the name of the variable, and then the value of the variable, which we'll say frigate. And then we'll print out the ship. Okay, now we're going to run our code, and because pilot X does not have a ship assigned to it, we're going to hit that else statement where it's going to declare that we don't have a ship, and then it's going to assign us frigate, and then print it out. See? Ship not found, assigning ship, and it gives us the ship frigate, and then prints it out. And just so we can demonstrate get attribute as well, let's assign a ship beforehand. Give it the name cargo. And then execute the code. Ship found, cargo. And so that's the third way to manage variables inside of an object. This is particularly useful for when you're dealing with objects that can have varying amounts of data, like they can be very, very different between each other, and they won't have the exact same things. They might have some base information that all of them share, like with pilot, they could have name and ID and ship and whatnot. But then there could be other pieces of information that one pilot may have that another pilot may not have. And if you got two pilot objects, one that's using all those variables and another one that's not using all those variables, that's kind of a waste of memory because of how Pi objects work in Python. Like, because of how variables work in Python, even if they're not being assigned something, they're still taking up a bit of memory. It may not be a lot in that small example, but say you're working with a program that is using up a lot of objects at once, and some of them are just not using up all the variables inside those objects, and that quickly builds up. So this is a way where you can set the variables that are necessary for each object to have without making it so they all have those variables at the same time. In fact, just to show you a really cool way that this can be utilized. All right, so we've got a dictionary of attributes here for our pilot. So now we're going to do a for loop for attribute and pilot attributes. Set attribute and pilot X. And remember, when we say for attribute in a dictionary, by default, it gives us the key. So basically, each iteration of this for loop, attribute will be ship, home station, then rank. So we'll use that as the variable name for our object. And then for the value, it will be pilot attributes at attribute. And then below, just to show that it worked, we'll say print x dot ship, print x dot home station, print x dot rank. It's important to note that when you do something like this, because these keys are going to be used as variable names, it's important to make sure that they follow the rules for variable names. They can't have special characters in them. They can't start with numbers. They can be all kinds of letters and underscores and whatnot, but that's pretty much it. So run the code. And there you have it, cargo, wayfare, and captain, just as we assigned through the attribute dictionary. Pretty cool, right? And so those are the three ways that we can assign variables to objects. I like using methods for when I'm using objects that are not going to have varying types of data and it's all the same across the board, simply because I can write those functions to perform input checking to make sure everything is right. I like using this method if I'm ever using objects that could have varying amounts of data, or if an object has its information defined by maybe a configuration file or something, like maybe a YAML file, and I can read everything in as a dictionary into Python and then pass that dictionary into the object when it's created. And even then, I can still do input checking when it's doing that. So that's still incredibly useful. And this makes it a little bit more cleaner and more organized when you do it this way, and it looks nice. And so that's how you can read, set, and even check attributes in Python. These are the three ways that you can do it. You can either do it directly, like x.ship, and then set it there, although I wouldn't really recommend it that way unless you're trying to hash together just a quick Python script. The second way, through methods, which is my preferred way. And then the third way, which I also like using, but I don't use it too often, especially if I'm not creating objects with varying amounts of data, is to use the three functions: set attribute, has attribute, and get attribute. All right, now is the time to actually create our object. Let's use our class to create a pilot object. So let's go back to the top level here. I'm not going to even make a main function. We're just going to start coding right here. We're going to say x equals pilot. We'll do a default pilot, and then we'll do y equals a pilot where we specify actual information. All right, so we got our two pilots. Now we're going to call x.greet. This is how we would call an object's method. We give the object variable name, which in our case is x and y, followed by a period, and then the name of the function itself, plus any parameters that actually need to be passed into the function. So x.greet, y.greet, they'll greet each other. Then x.present ID, y.present ID, and then we'll call the ship functions. So x.set ship to cargo, y.set ship to cruiser. Now, as you can see with set ship, we don't have anything printing out. It just sets a variable name. So if we want to print out the information, is we just say x.ship. I should probably put that in a print function. Otherwise, it won't print anything out. So let's print out y.ship, and then we're going to run the code. All right, so we execute our code, and because I set the default parameter for name to Crozo, they're both Crozo. I didn't think that one through, but they both say, hello, my name is Crozo. One has a pilot ID of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the other one of 6 sixes. One of them flies a cargo, the other one flies a cruiser. And that's pretty much it for the basics of Python classes. So I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it helpful. And if you did, then please hit the like button and leave a comment below to let me know what you think. If you want to see more, head on over to the Wayfarer Coding Academy channel to check out my other content. And while you're there, subscribe to the channel to stay up to date on new stuff as it comes out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.